So you went through the VX3, and then how did that end? How did that story, the whole that part of your life, come to a different chapter?
I guess I need to background the whole idea a little bit, that between World War II and Korea, well, at the end of World War II, I was in a hurry to get out, like everybody, and I did. And very shortly after I got out, I decided I didn't like being out, and I rode back to the Navy and tried to get back in. And they said, no, you missed it by a couple of weeks. We gave you 6 months after you got out. Everybody had 6 months they could get back in. Mm-hmm. And my friend Ted Hansen did that, and I didn't know it. But he did. If I'd known it, I'd have gone back then. But anyhow, I missed it, and so they wouldn't let me back in. So for the next 5 years there, I kept writing to my friend Malcolm Cagle, who was in Washington at that time, and tell him that I had all this night fighter experience, and he knew me, how I'd get me back in. And he'd write back and say, well, they're just not taking anybody right now. The money was too short. So I was trying to get back in other words, and then Korean War, he came in the news, and I don't remember, but it wasn't but a few weeks till I got the letter saying, you can get back in now. So that was what got me in, and at the end of the two years for me in Atlantic City, I was ready to get out again. So I'd wanted to get in, got back in, and found out the Navy wasn't what I thought it was or what I remembered at all. I was very unhappy with the Navy all during that VX3 Atlantic City period. And so when they came around and said, you can get out if you got this much time and so forth, I said, let me out right now. So I did. So sometime, I can't remember the exact date, but 51 I got out and went back to Atlanta. So I was ready to get out. In other words, short story there.
Okay.
Changing, vacillating back and forth, not knowing where my career was myself, being a young, unsmart person. I hadn't any picture of what I wanted to do or ought to do, so I was just jumping from one thing to the other.
Okay, so if my timeline is right here, you then you were the FBO operator. That was before, actually, I guess you went in the back in the Navy. I'm not sure. And then you went to Delta Airlines in '53.
Yeah.
Give us a little chapter on a little bit of information about that chapter. You were flying DC-3s, 6s, and 7s.
Yeah.
And the Constellation.
Didn't do a whole lot of flying. About, I guess, a little more than 6 months, 26 months and a year's worth of flying in Delta, because Delta's process, when you hire on as a pilot, you have to be a flight engineer first. You get on the flight engineer seniority list, and you fly flight engineer until you get seniority, and then you can become a pilot if you want to. Mm-hmm. So that's what I was doing primarily at Delta, was being flight engineer. And I was flying on Connies and DC-6s and DC-4s as flight engineer. But finally, would get some pilot time, but not much. I don't know, I think I got, on one of those, I can't remember now, I got about 300 hours, but not much flying time in those big airplanes. I didn't like the Connie at all for flying. It was a miserable flying airplane. DC-4 and 6 were fine flying airplanes. But the Connie had the advantage of having a real flight engineer's seat and panel. The pilots were forward, and the flight engineer was to turn face to side and back behind. So you had your own job there. But DC-6 and 7 had to carry a flight engineer with two pilots, but you didn't. You had to sit in a jump seat between the two pilots, just reach over there and try to reach it. And if they let you, you'd reach the controls. No, most of them wouldn't let you touch anything. Pilots wouldn't. So that was not a great flying period, but I got enough flying there to enjoy a little bit of the airline life and the way they operated and the scheduling and bidding for runs. And mostly the thing that got me out in a hurry was the nature of the people that were in there. I didn't like the people at all. I was mighty picky in those days. I didn't like the Navy, got out, and didn't like the airlines either.
You were learning what you did and didn't like when you first started out. Anything
in a hurry, I'll tell you. The Navy was full of drunkards and people who didn't care about anything about the Navy themselves or anything else. And I got in the airlines and decided that it was full of people who cared about themselves only and not the airline or other people. Yeah. And they were just terrible people. I decided immediately that I'd been there a few months that I didn't want to raise my family around that kind of people. So I got out of that the first chance.
And then you were the FBO of Fulton County Airport in Atlanta, Georgia,
Yeah.
in 54 and 55.
Uh-huh.
And then you went to Lockheed in 55, where you flew the 47, the P-47, the C-130, the Starlifter. And we talked about the Galaxy. And we talked about the LSA-60 and the C-130, but I don't think we talked about your being the Lockheed executive pilot flying that Lodestar, L-18 Lodestar.
Yeah. There's not a whole lot to say about that. It was very enjoyable. That was the bad thing about it was Lockheed was a foremost aircraft company, and yet they were flying an executive transport for their own people on an old airplane. Of course, it was Lockheed built, and they were proud of it, so I guess that worked out. But anyhow, it was really a pleasure to fly, and so I flew that. All the Lockheed method at that time was to assign the flight production flight operations pilots one at a time to the Lodestar. Well, two at a time. Everybody had to take their turn, in other words. That was kind of a punishment routine, I guess. But my friend Lloyd Harris was chief pilot at this time, and I had checked him out in the Lodestar so he could fly it. And so later on, a year or two later, whoever was flying it had his tour was up, I guess, and Lloyd asked me to fly it for a year, so I did, and enjoyed it very much, flying the Lockheed executives around the country in that airplane. It was a great old airplane.
Okay, let me take a checkpoint here.
The Lockheed Lodestar, of course, is what Howard Hughes flew around the world in '37, you know, so it was a really good airplane in its day.
Now, was it you or a friend of yours that you had to meet Howard Hughes on the far side of the airport?
Oh, that was somebody I knew from flight ops there. Pete
Okay.
Peterson did that. He was also a Jetstar pilot, and they called from California and said Howard Hughes wants to fly a Jetstar, and I guess he had bought 2 or 3 of them by that time, and they were parked there at Lockheed, Georgia, and they called and said he wants to fly, so bring an airplane out here. So Pete got the job, and Pete was, I think, second senior in the flight ops department there, so he got the job and went out there, and he did all that story. Went out there, and the instructions were to come to Palmdale Airport at midnight or something like that, and meet me at the west end of runway 14 or something like that. He didn't say meet me, he just said bring the airplane there, that's where I'll be. And so Pete goes out there and talks to the tower and everything. They said, well, if Howard Hughes said that's what he wants, you can go out there. So they let him, nobody else was flying in, so he taxied way out in the dark, big airport, and parked the airplane there, and got out of the airplane and stood there while nobody around. And after a while, the old 36 Chevrolet drove up on the far side of the fence around the airport space.
Right.
And presumably there's no way in, but he drove up right there, and a minute later disappeared in the dark, and first thing you know, he was right there by the airplane. And that was miles back to the base ops. I don't know how he got around there. Pete didn't know, he didn't see him. So he showed up, and Pete says, I'm Pete Peters from Lockheed, and he says, I'm Howard Hughes. And he didn't even slow down, Pete said. Pete was standing by the door, and Howard Hughes walked up and said, I'm Howard Hughes, and didn't shake hands with him, just said, I'm Howard Hughes, and walked right up the steps. And went into the cockpit and sat down in the left seat. And Pete real hustled around there and got in and said, wait a minute, I got to fly with you. You know, I can fly with you. You can fly, but I got to fly with you. He said, no, I don't want anybody with me at all. And Pete said, well, I can't let you take the airplane then, or something like that. I don't know how he got away with that. Howard Hughes liable to said anyhow, take it anyhow, but anyhow, he got away with it. So he said, okay, if you sit down and hush, don't talk, I'll be all right. So Pete sat down and he said Howard Hughes reached up. He'd never been in a Jetstar before, never flown one. He reached up and started the engine. Now that's not easy. You got to know a whole lot. But apparently he had read the handbook and memorized it very thoroughly. Because he reached up and started the engines and taxed out and took off. Wow. Never said a word to Pete. Flew around for, I don't remember, half an hour he said, and came back, landed, back to the same place and got out and said thanks. Left.
And then he bought some, didn't he?
Oh, I guess he bought 8 total.
Huh.
But he never flew any of them. He'd buy them every time a customer, this gets into sales, customers, Lockheed was in doubt of selling an airplane for $1 million. That's what it cost, the first airplanes. So, and they had production lines moving. They didn't want a lot of airplanes parked around unsold, I guess, from a sales standpoint. So some people ordered one, and there'd be a place in the line, and people ordered one to get in line, and then pretty soon it'd be an airplane nobody had ordered. And every time there was an airplane nobody had ordered, Lockheed sales would call Howard Hughes, and he'd say, okay, put it on my bill. And they'd move it over to this hangar where he stored his airplanes, and they'd sell it to him at a discount, I'm sure. But they sold it to him and didn't have an unsold airplane then. Mm-hmm. And so through that process, he acquired 8 airplanes, I believe, and parked them there and never moved them at all. Hmm. And they finally
these are Jetstars we're talking about.
Yeah, they were finally sold to individual corporate customers when the line stopped production, and then these airplanes became valuable. And Howard Hughes probably sold them for twice what he paid for them. He made a lot of money out of Lockheed. That's okay. They made a lot of money out of him for one thing or another, I guess. And he took up the slack in the line, so I guess it was kind of a mutual deal.
See, did the Jetstar have 2 or 4 engines?
The prototype, original Jetstar had 2 engines.
Okay.
But the production airplane had 4 engines. Yeah. Different engine. When the prototype was built, when Kelly Johnson built the first airplane in 60 days, the engine with the power they wanted wasn't available. The one they had planned on, it wasn't available. So they shopped around and got these British engines and put them on, and they were much stronger than what they thought, and they were so strong they only needed 2 of them. And I had the pleasure and the experience of flying that when they first started producing Jetstar. They sent the 2-engine airplane to Georgia from California, where they made it.
Do you have a Jetstar model?
This is the Jetstar that we're talking about, and this is the ultimate version, you might say, the final version, with 4 engines and the slipper tanks they're called here, neither one of which were on the airplane at first. The prototype had 1 engine on each side and no slipper tanks, just a clean wing. And it was a much prettier airplane from that standpoint, clean and flew well, did everything. It was a remarkable airplane, and that was the first swept-wing cabin or transport airplane that was certified in this company. The Boeing 707 came out before the Jetstar, and it flew, but it wasn't certified for a long time because it was going into passenger runs. So the FAA took a long time. But Lockheed got this certified as a swept-wing airplane, and the 2-engine airplane was the first one, and then the production airplanes all had the smaller but 4 of the engines, and then very shortly they decided that it didn't have the range that the business people wanted, so the only way they could add fuel, the best way to add fuel, was put these slipper tanks. They actually are slipper, they just slid on like that, and then had fairings to fill in the gap there, but then you could take them off and fly the airplane without them. So that was part of the development of the Jetstar. But as I was saying, I think I was saying that I flew the 2-engine airplane without slipper tanks for, I don't know, about 6 months there at Lockheed with Art Hansen. Art Hansen was also one of the senior pilots of flight operations, was there when I got there. And he and I flew the prototype airplane on the sales demonstration flights around the country for 6 months or so. And we're selling, just get somebody, a pilot to fly it and recommend it to his boss and buy one. That was a very interesting period. It had a single wheel landing gear with a little thin tire, and our first instruction was don't park this thing on a summer day on a asphalt ramp, because if you put the fuel in it, those little thin tires will just sink down and you can't get the airplane out. It'll sink down up to the hub in the asphalt, right through it. So, and we learned the hard way about that, because we had to get a tug to pull it out of there quite a few hours. But after we'd park somewhere and try to tell them fuel in a hurry and get the people on, then the people didn't show up or something. We had to sit there a little bit, and the wheel would be halfway into the paving, and we had to get a tug real quick to get it out, try to get it out of there before they made a bad impression on the customers that way. But the production airplane had dual wheels and didn't have any trouble at all with that, so they cured that very quick.
I seem to remember, was it the Jetstar? You met Kelly Johnson once, and you asked him a question, I think it was about the Jetstar wing.
Yeah, no, about flight controls.
Yeah. Tell me that story.
Well, Jetstar was one of the first hydraulically flight control hydraulically powered flight control systems. Kelly Johnson had made the first one, first production flight hydraulically powered flight controls in the P-38 during World War II. And there's a couple other airplanes in between that had them, but not many. There were not many hydraulic airplanes. So as they got faster, they needed more power, so they started making this, and the Jetstar was hydraulic. It had, on the overhead, it had two switches for elevator and aileron. The rudder was not powered. And you could turn those switches off, and you would have no hydraulics, and the airplane flew just fine. And you could turn them on, you had hydraulics, and it flew just fine, but it was a lot lighter on the controls. It had power assist, just like a car and power steering. And my question had always been, I'd seen all the drawings I could see, and I could see where the bell cranks and the control cables and the hydraulic unit was and everything, and I couldn't figure out how the hydraulics could power the controls without interfering with the mechanical system, mechanical controls. And that's what I asked Kelly Johnson, how'd you arrange that so that you didn't have interference there? And you could use either or both. And he just smiled and said, "You can't figure that out, can you?" And I said, "No, I can't." And he just left. He never answered me. But I finally figured it out, sort of. It's just mechanical advantages and fulcrums in the right place, beyond my ability to decipher, but I could figure out where it came from. But that was all I got out of Kelly Johnson. I muffed my opportunity to get any good information.